All right, let's jump right in. We're going to be talking about one of the most influential texts ever written, the book of Deuteronomy. Now, this book sits right at the theological heart of the Hebrew Bible. It's this powerful restatement of the covenant that doesn't just shape Judaism and Christianity, but it has actually shaped the very foundations of Western law and ethics. So yeah, this isn't some dusty ancient document. It is a living, breathing force in our world today.
And everything in this book really pivots around this one single monumental declaration. This is the Shema Israel. For thousands of years, this has been the central prayer, the core affirmation of monotheism in Judaism, recited every single day. You can think of it as the theological anchor for the entire book. It's this radical claim that God is absolutely one in a world that was once filled with countless gods. This single verse really sets the stage for all that's to come.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll look at what the book claims to be. Then we're going to unravel this really fascinating historical puzzle about where it actually came from. We'll connect it to a specific king and a pretty dramatic reform, dig into its core theological ideas, see how it laid out a blueprint for an entire nation, and then finally, we'll trace its absolutely incredible legacy through history.
Okay, so let's start with the name. Deuteronomy, it literally means second law. See, the book presents itself as a series of really powerful, emotional final speeches from Moses to the Israelites. You have to picture the scene. They are right on the edge of the Promised Land, and this is their final briefing. It's this stirring reminder of their history, their laws, their unique relationship with God, all being delivered to a new generation, a generation that didn't personally experience the exodus from Egypt or the revelation at Sinai.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, especially for historians and scholars. The book's own setting is crystal clear, Moses on the plains of Moab. But when we start to apply modern historical analysis, a pretty compelling puzzle starts to emerge about its true origins. And this question, who really wrote this book and when, has led to one of the most significant and debated theories in all of modern biblical scholarship.
So the whole issue boils down to the tension you see right here. On one hand, you have the traditional setting within the text itself, Moses, way back around the 13th century BCE, giving his farewell address. But on the other hand, there's a compelling body of scholarly evidence that points to the book's final form being written, or at least compiled, much, much later. We're talking the 7th century BCE, right in the middle of the court of a Judean king named Josiah. And these aren't just two different dates. They represent two profoundly different contexts for understanding why the book was written in the first place.
And that brings us to the key that for many scholars unlocks this whole puzzle, the connection to King Josiah. By placing the text into his world, into his historical moment, the book's most urgent themes and its most passionate arguments, they suddenly just snap into sharp focus. It changes from just being a look back at the past into a document with a really urgent contemporary mission.
So, the intellectual framework that gets us here is something called the documentary hypothesis. Now, this is a major theory in biblical studies. It basically proposes that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, weren't written by one person at one time, but were actually woven together from several different older source documents over many centuries. And within this framework, Deuteronomy, what scholars call the D source, is seen as its own distinct work, largely composed during that 7th century reform movement we just mentioned.
Let's just walk through the timeline to see how this all fits together. Before Josiah, the Israelite monarchy was, to put it mildly, a mess. There was widespread idolatry, and worship was happening at all these local shrines all over the place. Then, around 640 BCE, King Josiah comes to power and kicks off this massive religious reform. But the pivotal moment comes in 622 BCE. A book of the law, which most scholars believe was an early version of Deuteronomy, is dramatically discovered during renovations of the temple. And that discovery gives him the ancient authority he needs to supercharge his entire reform project.
And this was, frankly, a brilliant political and religious move. Think about it. By framing these brand new radical reforms, like destroying all the rural shrines and forcing everyone to come to Jerusalem to worship, by framing them as the recovery of an ancient law from Moses himself, Josiah gave them unimpeachable authority. The book's passionate arguments against idolatry and for one single central sanctuary directly address the crisis of his own time.
Okay, so we've dug into the historical context. Now let's pivot and look at the book's powerful theological core. What are the big ideas that are really driving this text? Well, it's this profound vision of a reciprocal relationship with God, where ethics and justice are woven right into the very fabric of faith. And the covenant itself is laid out as a very clear two-way street. First, it starts with God's loving choice. an act of pure grace. God didn't have to choose Israel, but did. Then comes Israel's required response: absolute exclusive loyalty and obedience to God's commands. And finally, the consequences are laid out in black and white. If you stick to the covenant, you get blessings and national prosperity. If you disobey, you get curses and disaster. The book lays out this momentous choice between life and death.
But, and this is so important, this isn't just about following rituals correctly. Deuteronomy's great innovation is what we call ethical monotheism. It argues that how you treat other people is itself a form of worship. Justice in the courts, fairness in your business dealings, and especially care for society's most vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. These aren't just nice social policies. They are core religious obligations, absolutely central to honoring the covenant.
So building on that ethical foundation, the book then provides this incredibly comprehensive legal code. And we're not talking about just a handful of rules here. This is a detailed blueprint designed to structure every single aspect of the nation's life around the principles of the covenant.
And this table gives you a sense of just how vast the scope is. I mean, it covers everything. You've got precise rules for worship at that central sanctuary. You've got regulations for a just legal system. You have social laws protecting the poor and marginalized, laws about family life, and even the rules of engagement for warfare. It's a truly holistic vision for an entire society, ordered by divine law.
So we've seen how a text that was very likely forged in the fire of a 7th century crisis became one of the most important documents in history. So let's trace its incredible impact, because its journey definitely doesn't end in ancient Israel. It goes on to become a foundational text for, well, a huge part of the world.
Its influence is just profound and so varied. For Judaism, it forms the very bedrock of religious law, known as halacha, and its command to teach the law diligently to your children makes memory and education central pillars of the faith. For Christianity, well, it's one of the Old Testament books that Jesus quotes most frequently. He even uses the Shema to define the greatest commandment. And then, beyond religion, its relentless focus on social justice and compassion for the vulnerable has echoed through millennia, inspiring countless movements for human rights and ethical government.
And that leaves us with this final, really powerful question. How does a document, a text that is so deeply rooted in the politics and the crises of one specific moment in time, transcend its own origins to become a source of timeless moral and spiritual guidance for billions of people across centuries and across civilizations? I think it's a testament to the enduring power of its core ideas. Ideas about justice, loyalty, and the very nature of our shared humanity.